You clean floors, Daniel. Stay in your lane. The laughter came quickly, echoing across the massive maintenance hangar as dozens of employees turned toward the source of the comment. Beneath bright industrial lights, surrounded by tool carts and diagnostic equipment worth millions of dollars, Daniel Carter stood quietly beside a towering jet engine mounted on a maintenance platform. He wore a janitor's uniform. His work gloves were worn. A cleaning cart sat a few feet behind him. Nothing about his appearance suggested he belonged anywhere near a $15 million engine. And yet his eyes never left the machine. Victoria Monroe, the CEO of Monroe Aerospace, crossed her arms and smiled. "I asked a simple question," she said. "Do you think you can fix it?" More laughter followed. Several engineers exchanged amused glances. A few supervisors shook their heads. The challenge was obviously a joke. The engine had become the company's most expensive headache. Teams of specialists had spent weeks studying it. Consultants had flown in from 3 different states. Nobody had found the answer. Nobody except, perhaps, the quiet janitor who spent every night cleaning the hangar floor. Daniel finally looked up. "I think something is wrong with it." The room erupted again. Victoria smiled wider. "That is a very safe answer." The enormous engine sat beneath white lights like a sleeping giant. Polished metal reflected across the hangar floor. The steady hum of ventilation fans filled the air. Then Daniel said something that made the laughter stop. "I think the problem is not where everyone is looking." Silence followed. Brief. Uncomfortable. Unexpected. Victoria tilted her head. "And where should we be looking?" Daniel glanced back toward the engine. "I would need more time." One engineer laughed. "Of course you would." Another shook his head. "This is ridiculous." Daniel did not respond. He simply returned to studying the machine. The reaction seemed to irritate Victoria slightly. Most people rushed to defend themselves when challenged. Daniel never did. He simply stood there with the same calm expression, the same quiet dignity, the same patience. Finally, Victoria turned toward the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, apparently our janitor knows something my engineering department does not." More laughter spread through the hangar. Daniel remained silent. He had learned long ago that arguing rarely changed minds. Results did. The moment passed. Meetings resumed. Engineers returned to their reports. Executives walked away discussing budgets and deadlines. Yet Daniel stayed behind. He continued looking at the engine long after everyone else left. Because something about it felt wrong. Not broken. Wrong. The distinction mattered. Hours later, after his cleaning shift officially began, the hangar grew quiet. The noise of the workday faded. The massive building settled into the rhythm of the evening. Daniel pushed his cart slowly between workstations, collecting trash and organizing supplies. But every few minutes, he glanced toward the engine. The machine seemed to pull at his attention. Around 9 o'clock that evening, he finally approached it again. No audience. No executives. No laughter. Just silence. The kind of silence that allows truth to speak. He walked around the engine carefully. His eyes moved across inspection panels, service markings, maintenance logs, and diagnostic reports. Then he stopped. His expression changed slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough. A small detail had caught his attention. A detail everyone else seemed to miss. Daniel leaned closer. His pulse quickened. The maintenance records attached to the engine told one story. The physical evidence told another. He looked again. Then again. The discrepancy remained. Outside the hangar, the evening sky darkened over the airfield. Runway lights flickered in the distance. Cool air moved across the tarmac. Inside, one quiet janitor stood beside a $15 million machine, while a question slowly formed in his mind. The question was simple. If the records were accurate, the damage should not exist. And if the damage existed, the records could not be accurate. Daniel stepped back and stared at the engine. 3 weeks later, every executive in Monroe Aerospace would wish they had listened to him that night. Because the secret hidden inside that machine was bigger than a mechanical failure. Bigger than a maintenance mistake. Bigger than anyone inside the company could imagine. And the first person to see it was the man everyone believed belonged only on the other side of a mop. Daniel Carter did not sleep much that night. After helping his 13-year-old daughter Emily finish her homework and settle into bed, he sat alone at the small kitchen table reviewing notes he had written from memory. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock above the refrigerator. A single lamp cast warm light across stacks of paper. Outside, a cool autumn breeze brushed against the windows. Daniel stared at the page in front of him. The discrepancy he noticed inside the engine continued bothering him. Maintenance records claimed one sequence of repairs. Physical wear patterns suggested something entirely different. The two realities could not exist together. One of them was wrong. The next morning began before sunrise. Daniel arrived at Monroe Aerospace carrying a travel mug of coffee and the same calm expression he wore every day. Employees rushed through the facility preparing for another busy schedule. Executives moved between meetings. Engineers reviewed technical reports. Nobody paid much attention to the janitor walking quietly through the corridors. Daniel preferred it that way. Attention often distracted people from observation. Observation was where truth lived. As he cleaned offices and maintenance areas throughout the morning, his mind remained fixed on the engine. Every detail replayed repeatedly. Every inconsistency. Every unanswered question. Around noon, he found himself standing near the maintenance hangar once again. The massive engine remained mounted on its platform. Engineers surrounded it discussing diagnostics. Screens displayed technical data. Charts covered nearby workstations. Millions of dollars and countless hours had already been invested in solving the problem. Yet Daniel could still see the same contradiction staring back at him. He hesitated for a moment. Then he approached one of the senior technicians. "Excuse me." The technician glanced up briefly. "What?" Daniel pointed toward the engine. "Have you compared the replacement records against the wear patterns inside the compressor section?" The technician blinked. "The what?" Daniel repeated the question. The technician frowned. Why would a janitor ask that? Several nearby employees overheard the exchange. Smiles appeared. One engineer chuckled softly. Another shook his head. Daniel remained polite. "Because the records do not seem to match what I observed." The technician laughed openly. "Observed while doing what?" "Sweeping." More laughter followed. Daniel nodded respectfully. "Something like that." The conversation ended quickly. Nobody asked another question. Nobody reviewed his concern. Nobody looked twice at the records. Daniel returned to work without complaint. That evening, however, something unexpected happened. As he cleaned a conference room, an older man entered carrying technical documents. Richard Hayes, Director of Engineering. Unlike many executives, Richard rarely dismissed people immediately. He noticed Daniel organizing chairs and paused. "You are the janitor who questioned the compressor records." Daniel looked up. "Yes, sir." Richard studied him carefully. "Why?" Daniel hesitated. Then he answered honestly. "Because the evidence does not agree with the paperwork." Richard raised an eyebrow. "That is a serious statement." "I know." Silence followed. Sunlight filtered through the conference room windows. Dust floated through golden beams of light. Richard placed his documents on the table. "Explain." For the next 15 minutes, Daniel described what he noticed. Not dramatically, not emotionally, calmly, methodically. Richard listened without interruption. As the explanation continued, his expression gradually changed. Curiosity replaced skepticism. Concern replaced amusement. When Daniel finished, neither man spoke immediately. Richard stared out the window toward the maintenance hangar in the distance. Finally, he looked back. "What exactly did you do before becoming a janitor?" Daniel smiled slightly. He had heard that question many times over the years. "A long time ago, I worked on aircraft engines." Richard folded his arms. "Worked on them?" Daniel nodded. "Designed them?" Silence settled across the room. The kind of silence that arrives when assumptions begin to crack. Richard studied him for several long seconds. Then he laughed softly. Not mockingly. Amazed. "You are serious." Daniel nodded. "Very." Richard picked up his documents. "Meet me tomorrow morning." Daniel blinked. "Why?" Richard smiled. "Because I want to see whether you are right." As Richard left the room, Daniel remained standing beside the conference table. Outside, evening sunlight stretched across the facility grounds. Employees hurried toward parking lots. Airplanes rested quietly beyond the hangars. For the first time since noticing the discrepancy, someone had listened. He did not know where the truth would lead. He did not know what it might reveal. But deep inside, one certainty remained. The engine was hiding something. And sooner or later, that hidden truth would force everyone at Monroe Aerospace to pay attention. The next morning, Richard Hayes arrived at the maintenance hangar before most of the engineering staff. The giant jet engine sat beneath bright white lights exactly where it had been for weeks. Diagnostic equipment surrounded it. Laptops displayed streams of technical data. Engineers moved between workstations carrying reports and inspection records. When Daniel Carter entered through a side door, pushing his cleaning cart, several people immediately noticed him. A few exchanged amused looks. One engineer whispered something that triggered quiet laughter. Daniel ignored it. He had spent too many years learning that respect earned through arguments rarely lasted. Respect earned through truth endured. Richard waved him over. "Show me." Daniel nodded and approached the engine. The surrounding conversation slowly faded as curiosity pulled more people toward the inspection area. Nobody openly admitted interest, but they stayed close enough to listen. Daniel opened several maintenance records and placed them beside inspection photographs. Then he pointed toward a series of documented repairs. These replacement dates do not match the wear patterns. Richard studied the pages. "Explain." Daniel remained calm. "If these components were installed when the records say they were, they should look different." One engineer crossed his arms. "That proves nothing." Daniel nodded. "By itself, no." He turned several pages. "But then I found this." Richard leaned closer. Several supervisors did the same. Daniel revealed a sequence of inspection reports completed over the previous 18 months. Individually, they appeared ordinary. Together, they told a different story. Richard's expression changed first. Then another engineer frowned. Then another. The room grew quieter. "That cannot be right," someone finally said. Daniel looked toward the engine. "I thought the same thing." Richard immediately requested additional records. Within an hour, boxes of archived documentation arrived from storage. Engineers who had laughed the previous day now sat around conference tables reviewing paperwork. The atmosphere shifted. Nobody was joking anymore. Nobody was smiling. Small inconsistencies began appearing everywhere. Missing signatures. Unusual approval timelines. Components listed in one system but absent in another. Nothing individually alarming. Yet together they formed a pattern. By afternoon, Richard requested a private meeting with Victoria Monroe. The CEO arrived looking impatient. Her schedule was already packed. The last thing she wanted was another discussion about the engine that had already consumed weeks of company resources. She entered the conference room, carrying a tablet. "Please tell me somebody has good news." Richard looked serious. "We found something." Victoria sat down. "A solution?" Richard hesitated. "Maybe a larger problem." Her expression hardened. "How much larger?" Silence followed. Then Richard slid several reports across the table. Victoria reviewed them quickly at first, then more slowly, then for a third time. The room remained quiet except for the soft turning of paper. Finally, she looked up. "Where did this come from?" Richard glanced toward the glass wall overlooking the hangar floor. Daniel was visible below, quietly cleaning a corridor. "Him." Victoria followed his gaze. For several seconds, she simply stared. "The janitor?" Richard nodded. "The former engineer." Victoria looked back at the reports. The realization clearly unsettled her. Not because the information was wrong, because it appeared increasingly correct. "Are we sure?" she asked. Richard answered carefully. "Not yet." He paused. "But I am sure enough to keep looking." That evening, long after most employees left, Daniel remained in the facility. He finished cleaning offices before returning to the hangar. The giant engine still sat beneath bright lights. Yet now it felt different. Not because the machine had changed, because people were finally paying attention. Richard approached, carrying another folder. "You were right about one thing." Daniel looked up. "Only one." Richard laughed softly. "So far." Then his expression became serious again. "The records are not adding up." Daniel nodded. "I know." Richard studied him. "You seem remarkably calm about this." Daniel glanced toward the engine. "The truth does not get stronger because people panic." Silence followed. The distant hum of ventilation systems echoed through the enormous hangar. Outside, darkness settled across the airfield. Richard looked at the engine and then back at Daniel. "What do you think we are going to find?" Daniel took a slow breath. His eyes remained fixed on the machine. "Something nobody wants to find." The answer lingered heavily between them. Because deep down, both men understood the same thing. Mechanical failures could be repaired. Documentation errors could be corrected. But if the growing pattern inside those records pointed where Daniel suspected, Monroe Aerospace was no longer dealing with an engine problem. They were approaching a truth capable of shaking the entire company. The investigation expanded quietly over the next several days. Officially, Monroe Aerospace was still troubleshooting a stubborn engine failure. Unofficially, Richard Hayes and a small group of trusted engineers were following a trail of inconsistencies that seemed to grow with every document they reviewed. What began as a technical question was slowly becoming something else entirely. Daniel Carter continued performing his janitorial duties as though nothing had changed. He emptied trash bins, cleaned conference rooms, organized maintenance areas. Yet every evening, after most employees left, he joined Richard inside a secure office where records covered nearly every available surface. Maintenance logs, inspection reports, component histories, procurement records. The deeper they looked, the stranger the story became. One evening, Richard placed a folder on the table and rubbed his forehead. "I do not understand this." Daniel looked up from a report. "What did you find?" Richard opened the folder. The replacement parts installed in the engine were approved on paper. He pointed toward a series of signatures. But the inventory system shows different serial numbers. Daniel studied the pages carefully. His expression remained calm. "And the installation dates?" Richard nodded. "They do not match either." Silence settled across the room. The soft hum of fluorescent lights filled the air. Outside the window, darkness covered the airfield. Daniel leaned back slightly. "Then somebody changed the records." Richard sighed. "That is what it looks like." The realization felt heavier when spoken aloud. Documentation errors happened. Administrative mistakes happened. But systematic inconsistencies appearing across multiple departments suggested something more serious. The next morning, Victoria Monroe requested an update. The meeting took place inside a glass conference room overlooking the maintenance hangar. Executives filled the seats. Department managers reviewed reports. Tension lingered beneath every conversation. Victoria listened as Richard summarized the findings. No accusations. No conclusions. Just facts. Missing documentation. Contradictory records. Unexplained approvals. When he finished, the room remained silent. Finally, one executive spoke. "Are we saying someone intentionally altered company records?" Richard answered carefully. "We are saying the records do not align with reality." Victoria folded her hands. "And what does Daniel think?" Several people shifted uncomfortably. The question itself revealed how much had changed. Weeks earlier, nobody cared what the janitor thought. Now executives waited for his opinion. Richard glanced toward Daniel, sitting quietly near the end of the table. "Daniel." Daniel looked around the room. "I think we are asking the wrong question." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "What is the right question?" Daniel paused. "Not who changed the records." The room grew still. Why were they changed? Nobody responded immediately. The distinction mattered. One question searched for a person. The other searched for a motive. And motives often revealed larger truths. After the meeting ended, Victoria stopped Daniel before he left. "Walk with me." Together they crossed an elevated hallway overlooking the facility floor. Workers moved below them between aircraft components and maintenance stations. Sunlight reflected through enormous windows. For several moments neither spoke. Finally Victoria broke the silence. "You have not asked for anything." Daniel smiled slightly. "Should I?" Most people would. He shrugged. "I am more interested in answers." Victoria studied him. "You really do not care what people think of you, do you?" Daniel looked down toward the hangar floor. "I care." He paused. "I just do not let it decide what is true." The answer lingered with her long after they separated. Later that afternoon, another discovery arrived. A junior analyst reviewing archived procurement files found a series of approvals connected to the engine program. At first glance, they appeared ordinary. Then one detail stood out. Several approvals had been processed through departments that should never have been involved. Richard immediately brought the documents to Daniel. Together, they reviewed every page. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Money had moved. Records had changed. Inspections had been altered. Yet none of it appeared random. Daniel stared at the final document and felt a chill of certainty. Richard noticed immediately. "What is it?" Daniel looked up slowly. "The engine was never the real problem." Richard frowned. "Then what is?" Daniel glanced toward the stack of files covering the desk. Years of paperwork. Hundreds of decisions. Thousands of signatures. The engine is just where the trail ends. Silence filled the room. Because for the first time, both men could see the outline of something much larger hiding behind the technical failure. Something connected not only to one machine, but potentially to decisions reaching far beyond the maintenance hangar. And somewhere inside Monroe Aerospace, a truth carefully hidden beneath paperwork and assumptions was beginning to surface. The question was no longer whether they would find it. The question was whether the company was prepared for what would happen when they did. The following week changed everything. What had started as a quiet internal review evolved into a formal investigation authorized directly by Victoria Monroe. The decision was not made lightly. Monroe Aerospace had built its reputation over decades. Trust was one of its most valuable assets. Yet the growing evidence left little choice. Too many records failed to align. Too many questions remained unanswered. And every path somehow led back to the same engine. Daniel Carter arrived at work on Monday morning and immediately sensed the difference. Conversations stopped when he entered certain rooms. Executives who previously ignored him now nodded politely. Engineers who once laughed now asked thoughtful questions. Respect had begun replacing skepticism, not because Daniel demanded it, because truth had a way of changing people. Richard Hayes met him outside the maintenance hangar. "We found something." Daniel could tell from his expression that it mattered. They walked together toward a secure conference room where stacks of files covered nearly every table. Several analysts sat reviewing documents. Computer screens displayed spreadsheets and procurement records. The atmosphere felt focused. Serious. One analyst looked up as they entered. "You need to see this." She handed Richard a report. He scanned the first page and immediately frowned. Then he handed it to Daniel. The report detailed purchases connected to engine maintenance contracts over the previous 4 years. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Then Daniel noticed the pricing. His eyes narrowed slightly. "These numbers are wrong." Richard nodded. "That is exactly what we thought." Component costs had been inflated repeatedly. Replacement schedules had been altered. Documentation justified purchases that should never have occurred. Individually, each discrepancy seemed small. Together, they represented millions of dollars. Silence settled across the room. One analyst finally spoke. "We checked 3 times." Another nodded. Then checked again. Daniel looked across the documents spread before him. The pattern was becoming clearer. Somebody had not merely hidden information. Somebody had built an entire system around hiding information. Later that afternoon, Victoria reviewed the findings personally. The conference room overlooking the airfield felt unusually quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Gray clouds covered the sky. Victoria sat at the head of the table while department leaders reviewed the evidence. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. The facts spoke loudly enough on their own. Finally, Victoria looked toward Richard. "How long?" Richard answered carefully. "At least 4 years." The room became still. For years. For years of altered records. For years of unexplained purchases. For years of approvals that no longer made sense. Victoria leaned back slowly. "And all of this surfaced because of an engine inspection?" Richard glanced toward Daniel. "Because someone asked the right question." Victoria followed his gaze. For several seconds, she simply looked at Daniel. The memory of her laughter inside the hangar returned uninvited. She remembered challenging him, mocking him, dismissing him. The realization settled heavily inside her. Daniel, however, showed no sign of satisfaction, no sign of revenge, no sign of triumph. He simply looked at the evidence, focused on the truth rather than the people involved. That difference mattered. As the investigation continued, another discovery emerged. Several approvals linked to the maintenance program traced back to a small group of senior managers. Not executives, not board members. Managers positioned just deeply enough inside the system to avoid attention. Richard reviewed the findings late into the evening. When he finally looked up, his face revealed both relief and concern. Relief because the truth was becoming visible. Concern because the implications continued growing. Daniel sat quietly across from him. "You found the source." Richard nodded slowly. "Maybe." Daniel looked toward the rain-covered windows. "Then the hard part begins." Richard frowned. "The hard part?" Daniel smiled faintly, accepting it. Outside, aircraft lights moved through the darkness beyond the airfield. Inside, stacks of evidence covered every available surface. The investigation no longer centered on an engine. It no longer centered on maintenance failures. It centered on integrity, on trust, on decisions made when nobody believed anyone was watching. The next morning, independent auditors arrived at Monroe Aerospace. Victoria personally authorized full cooperation. The moment marked a turning point. The company would no longer quietly review the issue. The truth would be examined openly, thoroughly, completely. As employees watched auditors enter conference rooms carrying boxes of files, rumors spread quickly throughout the facility. Questions filled hallways. Speculation filled break rooms. Yet Daniel continued working exactly as before. He cleaned floors, organized supplies, helped employees when they needed assistance. Because despite everything happening around him, he never forgot who he was. A father, a worker, a man guided by quiet integrity. And as another long day ended beneath the bright lights of the maintenance hangar, the giant engine remained exactly where it had been from the beginning. Silent, motionless, waiting. The machine that everyone believed was the problem had become something else entirely. A doorway. One simple question had uncovered a truth nobody expected to find. And the deeper investigators looked, the more impossible it became to hide. The arrival of independent auditors transformed Monroe Aerospace almost overnight. Conference rooms became temporary investigation centers. Storage archives were opened. Digital records were reviewed line by line. Employees who had never worried about paperwork suddenly found themselves answering detailed questions about decisions made years earlier. Yet through all the tension, one fact remained impossible to ignore. Every major discovery continued leading back to the same place. The engine, the machine everyone believed was the problem, had become the key to understanding something far larger. Daniel Carter spent most of his days exactly as he always had. He cleaned offices before sunrise, organized maintenance areas, helped technicians locate supplies. To anyone passing through the facility, he looked like the same quiet janitor he had always been. Yet behind closed doors, investigators increasingly relied on his observations. Not because he held authority, because his conclusions kept proving accurate. One afternoon, Richard Hayes entered the maintenance hangar carrying a thick binder. His expression revealed equal parts amazement and concern. Daniel noticed immediately. What happened? Richard placed the binder on a workbench. The auditors found another layer. Daniel wiped his hands on a cloth and stepped closer. Richard opened the binder. Inside were procurement records, approval chains, and financial summaries stretching back nearly 5 years. Several pages were marked with colored tabs. Look here. Daniel reviewed the documents carefully. At first the numbers seemed ordinary. Then the pattern appeared. Contracts repeatedly awarded to the same vendors. Inflated maintenance costs. Unnecessary component replacements. Duplicate approvals. Every detail alone appeared harmless. Together they formed something very different. Richard shook his head. This was not one mistake. Daniel nodded slowly. No, it was a system. The words lingered heavily between them. Because once a pattern became visible, it could not be unseen. Nearby, technicians moved through the hangar performing routine inspections. The normal rhythm of work continued. Yet beneath that ordinary activity, the company was changing. Later that evening, Victoria Monroe called an emergency leadership meeting. Executives gathered inside the largest conference room on the top floor. Rain fell steadily against the windows. The city skyline beyond appeared blurred beneath gray clouds. The atmosphere felt tense. Not because anyone knew exactly what would happen next, because everyone sensed the truth approaching. Victoria stood near the head of the table reviewing the latest audit summary. When she finally spoke, her voice remained calm. How extensive is it? An auditor answered directly. More extensive than we initially believed. Silence followed. Another executive shifted uneasily. The auditor continued. The maintenance discrepancies exposed a network of financial irregularities across multiple programs. Several heads lowered toward the reports. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. Facts had replaced speculation. Victoria turned another page. The numbers continued growing. Costs, contracts, approvals, patterns. Every discovery revealed another layer hidden beneath the previous one. Finally, she looked up. How did we miss this? The room remained quiet. Then Richard answered. Because nobody was looking in the right place. Victoria understood exactly what he meant. Her thoughts immediately returned to the maintenance hangar, to a janitor standing beside a jet engine while everyone laughed. The memory felt very different now. The following morning brought another breakthrough. Auditors completed a review of archived communications connected to the maintenance program. Several conversations revealed pressure to approve questionable purchases without proper review. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just enough to steer decisions in profitable directions for a small group of managers. When Richard shared the findings with Daniel, neither man celebrated. The evidence was becoming undeniable. Yet truth often carried consequences. Daniel studied the report quietly. People trusted these records. Richard nodded. That is the worst part. Outside the office window, aircraft taxied slowly across the runway. Bright morning sunlight reflected from their polished surfaces. The contrast felt striking. Machines designed for flight depended on trust. Trust in engineering. Trust in maintenance. Trust in integrity. Once trust eroded, everything else became harder to protect. By the end of the week, several managers had been placed on administrative leave pending further review. The announcements spread rapidly throughout Monroe Aerospace. Employees gathered in break rooms discussing developments. Rumors traveled through hallways. Questions multiplied. Yet amid all the uncertainty, one thing became increasingly clear. The company itself was not collapsing. It was confronting the truth. And there was a difference. Victoria understood that distinction better than anyone. One evening, she stood alone inside the maintenance hangar after most employees had gone home. The giant engine remained mounted beneath bright lights. Silent, motionless. She stared at it for several moments before noticing Daniel working nearby. "Funny, isn't it?" she said. Daniel looked up. "What is?" Victoria gestured toward the engine. "I spent weeks believing this machine was our biggest problem." Daniel smiled gently. "Most people see what is directly in front of them." Victoria folded her arms. "And you saw beyond it." Daniel glanced toward the engine. "I just asked a question." Silence followed. The soft hum of the hangar echoed through the enormous space. Then Victoria shook her head and laughed quietly. A question that changed everything. And as she stood beneath the bright industrial lights looking at the machine that had revealed years of hidden truth, she realized something important. The investigation was no longer searching for answers. The answers had already begun to appear. What remained was deciding what kind of company Monroe Aerospace would become once the truth was fully revealed. 3 days later, Monroe Aerospace entered a moment nobody inside the company would ever forget. The independent auditors completed their preliminary findings. What had once existed as scattered suspicions now stood supported by documentation, timelines, financial records, and verified approvals. The truth was no longer hiding. It was sitting in plain sight. Early that morning, department leaders gathered inside the largest conference room in the building. The atmosphere felt different from every meeting before it. Nobody arrived confident. Nobody arrived comfortable. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, sunlight stretched across the airfield. Aircraft moved slowly along distant taxiways. Inside, silence carried more weight than conversation. Victoria Monroe sat at the head of the table. Richard Hayes reviewed the final audit summary. Several legal advisors occupied seats along the far wall. Senior managers waited quietly. Daniel Carter was not supposed to be there, at least according to the original invitation list. Yet when Victoria entered the room, she personally asked him to take a seat. Some executives noticed. None objected. The meeting began. One auditor stood and opened a presentation. Charts appeared on the screen. Financial summaries followed. Procurement histories. Maintenance records. Approval chains. Every category pointed toward the same conclusion. A coordinated group of managers had manipulated maintenance programs, redirected contracts, altered documentation, and concealed discrepancies over several years. The room remained completely silent. No one interrupted. No one challenged the evidence. The facts had become overwhelming. One executive finally spoke. "How much did we lose?" The auditor answered calmly. "Several $1 million in direct costs." Another executive lowered his eyes. Someone else exhaled slowly. Victoria remained motionless. The numbers mattered, but something else mattered more. Trust. The company had been built on trust. Trust in engineering. Trust in safety. Trust in accountability. Watching that trust compromised felt heavier than any financial report. Then the auditor revealed something unexpected. "There is additional information." Every eye lifted. The screen changed. A timeline appeared. It showed exactly how the investigation began. One maintenance inconsistency. One inspection question. One observation inside a hangar. One employee willing to notice what others ignored. The room slowly turned toward Daniel. He immediately looked uncomfortable. Recognition had never been his goal. Victoria studied the timeline carefully. The entire chain of discoveries traced back to a single moment beside the engine. A moment most people barely remembered. Except now it had become impossible to forget. Richard stood and addressed the room. If Daniel had not spoken up, none of this would have been found. Silence followed. Not awkward silence. Respectful silence. The kind that appears when people realize they were wrong about someone. Later that afternoon, company-wide announcements were distributed. Employees learned that the investigation had confirmed widespread procedural misconduct involving a small group of managers. Corrective actions would begin immediately. New oversight systems would be implemented. External reviews would continue. Transparency would become a priority. Across the facility, reactions varied. Some employees felt shocked. Others felt relieved. Many felt both. Yet one conversation appeared repeatedly. People kept asking the same question. How did the janitor see what everyone else missed? Daniel heard the question more than once that day. His answer never changed. I looked. Nothing more. Nothing dramatic. Just the truth. As evening approached, Victoria walked through the maintenance hangar alone. The giant engine remained mounted beneath bright industrial lights. Workers had finally identified the technical issues. Repairs were underway. Yet the machine no longer represented failure. It represented revelation. She found Daniel organizing supplies near the far wall. The board reviewed the findings, she said. Daniel nodded politely. And Victoria smiled faintly. Everything is changing. Daniel looked around the hangar. Maybe that is not a bad thing. She followed his gaze. Employees worked together across the facility floor. Engineers, technicians, maintenance staff, supervisors. People who previously occupied separate worlds now seemed connected by a shared understanding. Victoria turned back toward him. You know, when this started, I thought you were trying to prove people wrong. Daniel smiled gently. No. Then what were you trying to do? He paused before answering. Understand what was true. The words stayed with her long after the conversation ended. Because that simple difference explained everything. Some people chase recognition. Some chase victory. Daniel had chased truth. And now, for the first time, the entire company could finally see where that quiet determination had led. The investigation was over. The facts were established. The hidden system had been exposed. But perhaps the most important change was something no report could measure. Respect had replaced assumption. And throughout Monroe Aerospace, people were beginning to understand the value of listening before judging. The weeks that followed felt unlike anything Monroe Aerospace had experienced in years. The investigation findings had been accepted. Corrective measures had begun. New oversight systems were implemented. Independent reviews continued. Yet the most noticeable change was not found inside reports or policy updates. It was found in people. Conversations sounded different. Meetings felt different. Employees who once worked inside separate layers of the organization now interacted with a new sense of awareness. Assumptions had been challenged. Respect had been earned in unexpected places. Daniel Carter noticed it every day. He still arrived before sunrise. He still pushed the same cleaning cart through the same hallways. He still wore the same janitor uniform. Yet people greeted him differently now. Engineers stopped to ask his opinion. Supervisors invited him into technical discussions. Executives acknowledged him when they passed. Daniel accepted every interaction with the same quiet grace. He never reminded anyone that he had been right. He never mentioned the laughter inside the hangar. He simply continued showing up and doing his work. One morning, Richard Hayes found him organizing maintenance supplies. The board wants to meet you. Daniel smiled faintly. Why? Richard laughed. You know why. Daniel closed a storage cabinet. I'm not sure I do. Richard shook his head. That is exactly why they want to meet you. A few days later, Daniel entered the executive conference room overlooking the airfield. Large windows filled the space with morning sunlight. Board members sat around a polished table. Victoria Monroe occupied her usual seat at the front. The atmosphere felt formal, but not intimidating. Daniel noticed something unusual immediately. Every person in the room stood when he entered. He paused, slightly confused. Victoria smiled. Please sit down. Daniel took a seat. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then one board member leaned forward. Mr. Carter, we wanted to thank you. Daniel nodded politely. Another member added, your actions protected this company. A third continued, and probably its future. Daniel listened quietly. When they finished, he offered a simple answer. I only asked questions. The room fell silent. Not because the response sounded impressive, because it was honest. Victoria finally spoke. Most people would have stayed silent after being dismissed. Daniel looked toward the windows. Aircraft moved across the distant runway beneath a bright blue sky. Maybe. Victoria waited. Daniel continued. But silence is useful only when it protects dignity, not when it hides truth. Several board members exchanged thoughtful glances. The meeting lasted less than an hour. Before it ended, Victoria presented Daniel with an offer. A senior advisory position within the engineering division. Competitive salary. Flexible schedule. Full benefits. Recognition that reflected his expertise. The room waited for his response. Daniel looked at the proposal carefully. Then he surprised everyone again. May I think about it? Victoria smiled. Of course. That evening he drove home beneath the warm glow of a setting sun. The proposal rested on the passenger seat. His thoughts remained elsewhere. At home, Emily sat at the kitchen table working on a science project. She looked up as he entered. How was your day? Daniel smiled. Interesting. She laughed. That usually means something happened. He sat beside her and explained the offer. Emily listened carefully. When he finished, she thought for several seconds. Then she asked a question only a child could ask so simply. What do you actually want? Daniel looked at her. The question felt surprisingly difficult. Not because he lacked an answer, because he had spent years focusing on responsibility rather than preference. Later that night, after Emily went to bed, he sat quietly on the back porch. Cool evening air drifted through the neighborhood. The stars appeared one by one above the dark sky. He thought about engineering, about fatherhood, about second chances, about purpose. The following morning, he returned to Monroe Aerospace carrying a decision. Victoria met him inside the maintenance hangar. The same hangar where everything began. Bright lights reflected across polished metal surfaces. Technicians worked nearby. The giant engine remained mounted in its service bay, now fully repaired. Victoria folded her arms. Well, Daniel smiled. I will accept. She nodded. Good. Then Daniel added something unexpected. But I want to spend part of my time mentoring younger employees. Victoria blinked. That is your condition? Daniel nodded. Knowledge should not stay hidden. Victoria laughed softly. After everything that happened, I think that might be the smartest proposal anyone has made around here. Together they looked across the hangar floor. Workers moved between projects. Conversations filled the air. Energy had returned to the facility. Yet beneath all the activity existed something deeper. A renewed commitment to integrity. A renewed respect for truth. And standing beside the engine that revealed it all, both of them understood the same thing. Monroe Aerospace had survived not because one man exposed a problem. It survived because one man cared enough to ask questions when everyone else stopped looking. 6 months later, the maintenance hangar looked almost the same. The same bright industrial lights reflected across polished floors. The same aircraft components rested on service platforms. The same steady hum of equipment echoed through the enormous building. Yet everything felt different. Monroe Aerospace had changed. New oversight systems protected accountability. Training programs emphasized integrity as much as technical excellence. Young engineers openly sought advice from experienced workers regardless of job title. The invisible walls that once separated departments had grown smaller. Respect had become part of the culture. And at the center of that transformation stood a man who never asked for recognition. Daniel Carter walked through the hangar carrying a tablet instead of a cleaning cart. His new advisory role allowed him to mentor engineers, review technical concerns, and help train future leaders. Yet he remained exactly the same person. He greeted custodians with the same respect he offered executives. He listened more than he spoke. He cared more about solutions than credit. Most importantly, he never forgot why he worked so hard in the first place. Emily. One afternoon, Victoria Monroe stood on an observation platform overlooking the facility floor. Through the large windows, sunlight streamed across the hangar. Below, Daniel was leading a small group of young engineers through a discussion. Nobody seemed concerned about titles. Nobody appeared interested in status. They were simply learning. Victoria smiled. Richard Hayes joined her a moment later. Quite a difference from 6 months ago. Victoria nodded. It is. Richard looked toward Daniel. You know, he still refuses to take credit. Victoria laughed softly. That is probably why people trust him. The two stood in comfortable silence. Sometimes the most important victories arrive quietly, not with applause, not with headlines, just steady evidence that something good had taken root. That evening, Daniel arrived home carrying a small cardboard box. Emily met him at the door. "What is that?" she asked. Daniel placed the box on the kitchen table and opened it. Inside sat an old metal nameplate that had recently been removed during facility renovations. Emily picked it up carefully. The engraved letters were worn from time. "Why did they give this to you?" Daniel smiled. "Because it belonged to the engineering department from many years ago." Emily looked confused. "Before you worked there?" Daniel nodded. "Before I left engineering the first time." Emily turned the nameplate over in her hands. "Are you going to hang it up?" Daniel looked around the small kitchen. The house was modest. Nothing fancy, nothing extravagant. Just home. "Maybe," he said. Emily smiled. "I think you should." Later that night, after dinner, they sat together on the back porch. The sky glowed orange before slowly fading into deep blue. Neighborhood lights flickered on one by one. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. Emily rested her head against her father's shoulder. "Dad." "Yes." "Were you upset when people laughed at you?" Daniel thought for a moment. "A little." "Then why did you help them?" He looked toward the horizon. The answer came easily. "Because being hurt and being wrong are not the same thing." Emily considered that quietly. "I think I understand." Daniel smiled. "Good." The evening settled peacefully around them. No reporters. No celebrations. No dramatic speeches. Just a father and daughter sharing a quiet moment beneath the stars. And somehow, that felt more meaningful than any award ever could. Across town, Monroe Aerospace continued moving forward. The company had survived difficult truths because people chose integrity over comfort. A CEO learned humility. Employees learned respect. A culture learned the value of listening. And a single father proved something powerful without ever trying to prove anything at all. His dignity never depended on titles. His worth never depended on recognition. His strength came from character, from grace, and from the quiet decision to keep doing what was right even when nobody seemed to notice. In the end, the laughter disappeared. The assumptions disappeared. The doubts disappeared. What remained was respect. The kind that cannot be demanded and cannot be purchased. The kind earned through truth. The kind that arrives when integrity stands firm long enough for the world to finally catch up. And if this story reminded you that quiet strength often speaks louder than pride, share your thoughts below. Tell us where you have seen dignity overcome doubt. And subscribe for more stories that celebrate second chances, grace, and the extraordinary power of ordinary people.